Among the Hidden by Margaret Peterson Haddix. This is the first book in a 7-book series called the Shadow Children series. This one was written in 1998, and it is a fiction book since it does take place in the future, so some things are definitely made up, and it is set in a time that hasn't happened yet. There is not a specific date or location given, so our setting is pretty vague for now until we keep reading, and we'll mention this as we read quite a bit, but that's on purpose. Haddix wanted this book to feel like it could happen to everyone. It could happen anywhere, anytime, that the events in this book are very possible and no one is really safe from them. And so nothing very specific is given. It honestly feels like it could have been set in a time like today, or it could have been set 20 years ago. As we read, we'll discuss different themes. We'll make sure that the plot events make sense. We will plot everything on Plot Mountain, discuss feelings, cause and effect, predictions and inferences, some similes and symbolism. There are 30 chapters in this book with twists and cliffhangers, and some of the chapters are very short, so hopefully you're on the edge of your seat and you'll find parts of this book that pull you in, and before you know it, you'll have successfully read one whole chapter book. So let's do this. Among the Hidden by Margaret Peterson Haddix. Chapter 1. He saw the first tree shudder and fall far off in the distance. Then he heard his mother call out the kitchen window, "Luke, inside now!" He had never disobeyed the order to hide. Even as a toddler, barely able to walk in the backyard's tall grass, he had somehow understood the fear in his mother's voice. But on this day, the day they began taking the woods away, he hesitated. He took one extra breath of fresh air, scented with clover and honeysuckle and, coming from far away, pine smoke. He laid his hoe down gently and savored one last moment of feeling warm soil beneath his bare feet. He reminded himself, "I will never be allowed outside again. Maybe never again as long as I live." He turned and walked into the house as silently as a shadow. "Why?" he asked at the supper table that night. It wasn't a common question in the Garner house. There were plenty of hows. How much rain the backfield get? How's the planting going? Even what's? What did Matthew do with the 5/16 wrench? What's Dad going to do about that busted tire? But why? Wasn't considered much worth asking. Luke asked again, "Why do you have to sell the woods?" Dad harumphed and paused in the midst of shoveling forkfuls of boiled potatoes into his mouth. "Told you before, we didn't have a choice. Government wanted it. You don't tell the government no." Mother came over and gave Luke's shoulder a reassuring squeeze before turning back to the stove. They had defied the government once with Luke. That had taken all the defiance they had in them. Maybe more. Pausing real quick for a one-sentence summary so far, we know our who in the story is Luke, and the rest of his family, we don't know their specific names yet, but they are the Garner family. And he lives somewhere where there are woods, but now the woods are getting taken away. He doesn't get to go outside anymore. He asked why. The government bought the woods, and that wasn't something they could argue with. They did use the word defy, which means stand up against or refuse, and they said that they had defied the government with Luke before. And because of that, they definitely don't have any defiance left in them. They weren't going to be able to fight the fight against the government to keep the woods. Okay, that was way more than one sentence, but that was a summary. We wouldn't have sold the woods if we hadn't had to, she said, ladling out thick tomatoey soup. The government didn't ask us if we wanted houses there. She pursed her lips as she slid the bowls of soup onto the table. But the government's not going to live in the houses, Luke protested. At 12, he knew better. But sometimes still pictured the government as a very big, mean, fat person, 2 or 3 times as tall as an ordinary man, who went around yelling at people, "Not allowed," and "Stop that." It was because of the way his parents and older brothers talked. Government won't let us plant corn there again. Government's keeping the prices down. Government's not going to like this crop. Probably some of the people who live in those houses will be government workers, Mother said. It'll all be city people. If he'd been allowed, Luke would have gone over to the kitchen window and peered out at the woods, trying for the umpteenth time to picture rows and rows of houses where the firs and maple oaks had now stood, or had stood. Luke knew from a sneak peek right before supper that half the trees were now toppled. Some already lay on the ground. Some hung at weird angles from their former lofty positions in the sky. Their absence made everything look different, like a fresh haircut exposing a band of untanned skin on a forehead. That's a simile. Even from deep inside the kitchen, Luke could tell the trees were missing because everything was brighter, more open, scarier. And then when those people move in, I have to stay away from the windows? Luke asked, though he knew the answer. The question made Dad explode. He slammed his hand down on the table. Then you gotta stay away now! Everybody and his brother's going to be tramping around back there to see what's going on. They see you? He waved his fork violently. Luke wasn't sure what the gesture meant, but he knew it wasn't good. No one had ever told him exactly what would happen if anyone saw him. Death? That was what happened to the runt pigs who got stepped on by their stronger brothers and sisters. Death was a fly that stopped buzzing when the swatter hit it. He had a hard time thinking about himself in connection with the smashed fly or the dead pig, gone stiff in the sun. It made his stomach feel funny even trying. I don't think it's fair. We've got to do Luke's chores now, Luke's other brother Mark grumbled. Can't he go outside, maybe at night? Luke waited hopefully for the answer, but Dad just said no without looking up. I think it's important that they used the word hopefully to describe how Luke was waiting, showing us that he was probably hoping for a certain answer. And from what else he said about going outside, we can infer that he was hoping Dad would say yes. He's hoping he can go outside and do chores. He wants to. He wants to do something and be outside. It's not fair, Mark said again. Mark was the second son. Lucky second, Luke thought, when he was feeling sorry for himself. Mark was 2 years older than Luke, and barely a year younger than Matthew, the oldest. Matthew and Mark were easily recognizable as brothers, with their dark hair and chiseled faces. Luke was fairer, smaller-boned, softer-looking. He often wondered if he'd ever look tougher like them. Somehow, he didn't think so. Luke don't do nothing nohow, Matthew jeered. We won't miss his work at all. It's not my fault, Luke protested. I'd help more if... Mother laid her hands on his shoulders again. Hush, all of you. Luke will do what he can. He always has. The sound of tires on their gravel driveway came through the open window. Now who? Dad started. Luke knew the rest of that sentence. Who could that be? Why were they bothering him now? His first chance all day to sit down. It was a question Luke always heard the end of from the other side of a door. Today, skittish because the woods were coming down, he scrambled up faster than usual, dashing for the door to the back stairs. He knew without watching that Mother would take his plate from the table and hide it in a cupboard, would slide his chair back into the corner so it looked like an unneeded spare. In 3 seconds, she would hide all evidence that Luke existed, just in time to step to the door and offer a weary smile to the fertilizer salesman or the government inspector or whomever else had come to interrupt their supper. So the chapter hasn't given us a lot of details so far about exactly why he's hiding, what is their life like, where do they live, but you can already start to make connections. This is a 12-year-old boy with 2 older brothers. They live on a farm. They have chores to do. One thing that happens to him, though, that I don't think any of us could relate to is that it takes 3 seconds to make it look like he has never existed in this home. 3 seconds. So take a second and picture your house. The yard, the sidewalk, the door, the porch, even if it's an apartment building or a trailer, just that entryway. Now open the door. The floor around that entryway. Hooks where there's backpacks or coats. Are there shoes by the door? Is there homework on the couch? Are there family pictures on the wall? Are there some of your papers on the fridge? Think of all the things that show you live there. And in this world, in his world, his life can be erased from that part of the house in seconds. So just think about how that means that he lives. How they have to clean behind themselves. How many things he can't leave out. How many hobbies he can't just have laying around. And we can start to understand him, and that will help us understand and predict what he might think and feel and do in the rest of the book.